This video was brought to you by Henson Shaving. As you probably already know, the UK's public finances aren't in great nick at the moment. Rachel Reeves spent much of last year complaining about a £100 billion black hole in the state finances. The tax burden is heading to a post-war high, and the UK's debt to GDP ratio has just breached 100%, one of the highest in the world. Unfortunately, we hate to be the bearers of bad news here, there's reason to think that things are even worse than they appear. Because when you take a more comprehensive look at the government's finances, looking not just at its debts, but also its assets, i.e. the stuff it owns, the UK looks like quite literally the most impoverished state in perhaps the developed world. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what's known as public sector net worth, explain why it's perhaps the best measure of a country's fiscal health, and why the UK fares particularly badly under this metric. If you want more UK political drama from us, then check out our podcast Starmageddon, where we track the successes and failures of this new Labour government. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So, let's start with a bit of context. When evaluating a country's public finances, almost everyone today uses debt to GDP ratios. As the name suggests, a debt to GDP ratio basically takes the amount of debt that a country's government owes and compares that to the size of the country's economy, as reflected in its GDP figures. This is widely taken to be a reliable indicator of a country's fiscal health, or at least better than just looking at a country's debt levels, because obviously, bigger economies with bigger GDPs can more easily raise the money and taxes required to pay off their debts. On this measure, the UK doesn't look like it's in a great place. According to the IMF, the UK's debt to GDP ratio has risen from about 35% in the 2000s to just over 100% today, one of the highest in the world. However, while debt to GDP is undeniably a useful measure, especially when it comes to international comparisons, it's still very much imperfect. The main reason it's imperfect is that it totally overlooks a country's assets. In other words, it only looks at what a country owes and not what it owns. This is a pretty enormous oversight, because obviously whether or not you can pay your debts very much depends on what you actually own. This is why businesses, for instance, produce balance sheets, which look at both assets, i.e. the stuff they own or are owed, and liabilities, i.e. the stuff that they owe to other people, including debts. In this light, debt to GDP is too narrow a measure. It only looks at one side of the balance sheet. In part because of this, late last year, Chancellor Rachel Reeves announced that she'd be using a more comprehensive measure to evaluate the government's compliance to her fiscal rules, namely public sector net financial liabilities, charmingly nicknamed PSNUFL in the Treasury. PSNUFL is more comprehensive, insofar as it also looks at some of the government's assets, specifically the government's financial assets, which mainly includes about £89 billion worth of student loans owed to the government, and the government's equity stakes in certain companies, like NatWest, which was partially nationalised after 2008, and OneWeb, a satellite company that Boris Johnson bought during the pandemic. However, there's an even more comprehensive metric available, and that's public sector net worth, which doesn't have a catchy nickname like PSNUFL, but is often abbreviated to PSNW. On the asset side, PSNW looks at both financial and non-financial assets, including stuff like land, infrastructure, and roads owned by the state. And on the liabilities side, PSNW looks at both the direct government debt, but also other liabilities, like the government's pension obligations to people who work or used to work for the government. Although this is somewhat offset by the fact that PSNW also includes all of the stuff that the government owns in its pension funds. Now, there are some problems with PSNW. It's complicated, difficult to measure, and requires you to make a lot of assumptions. Valuing non-financial assets is also really difficult. For instance, how much is the M1, or the land owned by the Ministry of Defence, really worth? And there's something a bit fishy about including them in a measure of fiscal health, given that they can't really be sold to pay off any debts. And finally, even PSNW doesn't capture everything. After all, in a sense, a government's greatest asset is its ability to levy taxes, and its greatest liability is its implicit promise to protect and provide for its citizens. Nonetheless, it's at least true to say that PSNW is better than the alternative measures like per snuffle or plain old debt to GDP. Not only is it more comprehensive, but it also provides better incentives. Most obviously, it encourages investments that will increase the country's overall net worth, unlike debt to GDP, which actively encourages countries to sell off or privatize their national assets on the cheap to pay off short-term debts. And this is one of the UK's big problems. Investment has been chronically low, in large part because politicians have an incentive to shirk it in order to keep down debt to GDP, even if that means that the country is falling into disrepair. Using PSNW would also force politicians to actually address the looming demographic crisis, which is one of the main reasons that pension obligations, as a percentage of tax revenues, are expected to balloon in the coming years. So why hasn't the UK switched to PSNW, given these apparent advantages? Well, it's in part because, despite the IMF's best efforts, everyone still uses debt to GDP as their preferred metric for international comparisons. But it also might be because things look even worse for the UK when you look at PSNW rather than debt to GDP. According to IMF data, for the few countries that have calculated their PSNW, the UK is one of just a handful of countries to have a negative net worth. And according to a 2021 OBR analysis of the IMF's data, the UK actually has the lowest net worth of all of the countries for which data is available. Astonishingly, the UK's PSNW, as a percentage of GDP, is lower than even countries like Greece and Italy, who are often held up as paradigm cases of fiscal incontinence when we just look to debt to GDP ratios. Somewhat depressingly, the UK's PSNW as a percentage of GDP has actually steadily declined since the 70s, down from a peak of about 100% of GDP to minus 34% at the end of 2019, according to OBR calculations. Now, this is in part because the UK has some of the most expensive pension obligations in the developed world, but it's mainly because the UK doesn't really have any assets anymore. They were all privatised years ago. Privatisation went further in the UK than in most other countries. The UK is an international outlier, for instance, for having privately owned water industry, at least in England and Wales. This contrasts markedly with countries like France, which have a higher debt to GDP ratio than the UK, but are actually in much better financial health because they own far more assets. The French state, for instance, has stakes in a whole load of strategically important companies, and is actually the largest landowner in France, with over 200,000 properties and nearly 100 million square meters of land. All in all, this should make for some pretty irritating reading for us Brits, who might be realizing that things are even worse than they initially looked. Irritation, though, is something that those of us who shave regularly are all too used to. In fact, lots of people actively don't like shaving. After all, it's expensive, with brands selling overpriced razor cartridges filled with useless technology, and even if you do pay for all of that stuff, you're often left with a bad experience: razor burn, ingrown hairs, and irritation. That's a problem that Henson Shaving have aimed to solve with their razor, one that's actively designed to protect your skin. In fact, Henson razors are better for 3 reasons. Firstly, Henson's AL13 razor, which they produce at their aerospace machine shop, holds blades at a perfect 30-degree angle, extending the blade only 0.0013 inches past the shave plane. That's less than the thickness of a human hair, and ensures that the blade is supported properly, unlike many other companies' blades, which in turn makes sure that you have a far better shave for your skin. Secondly, they're just cheaper. Those fancy blade cartridges are full of single-use junk, which makes each individual blade vastly more expensive than it has to be. Henson's razor takes totally standard blades, which cost just a few cents, which means that you can save money and can afford to replace your blades more often, so that you don't need to keep dragging a dull razor across your face just to try and get value out of that overpriced plastic. Speaking of plastic, those other cartridges certainly aren't good for the environment either, with 2 billion razor cartridges thrown away every year in the US alone. That's not true of Henson's blades though, which contain 0 plastic, even in their packaging. If you want to try it out, then click the link in the description, add a razor and 100 blades to your cart, and then once you've done that, use our discount code TLDR at checkout, and you'll get all of those blades absolutely free. Using our link and our code also means that they know that you came from us, which really helps us out.